Lisa, tell us a little bit about you and your experience in learning and development.
I'm a Senior Learning and Development Advisor at Ensley. Been there just over 2 years, but I have actually got 15 years of experience in the field of learning and development. I'm passionate about what I do and find it hugely rewarding to be able to help people achieve their aspirations whilst they're making a difference to the organisation at the same time.
You've written a guide for student unions, guilds, associations and councils. Can you tell us what the guide's about?
Of course, yeah. It's really all about planning induction training for new staff to the unions. It covers things like learning preferences and learning styles, as well as the theory of learning.
Okay. What is an induction plan and why do you need to create one for new recruits?
Well, an induction plan is really just a schedule or an itinerary of the type of training that's given when you start a new job. As a minimum, it should cover the first 3 months of employment, but depending on the complexity of the role, it may be that it needs to last for longer than that, maybe 6 months. The key objective of an induction plan should be to ensure that your new employees know exactly what's required of them and that they're comfortable in their new role. One of the key reasons for creating an induction plan for new starters is to really start creating the right impression for them. So, do they understand the culture of your organisation? Do they understand the values and so on? It's quite often the first opportunity for them to start forming an impression of you. So it's critical that you start creating that right impression early on.
So how do you compile an induction plan?
Well, when you begin, there are some elements that will appear in every single induction plan. There are some sort of general or mandatory things. So that gives you your head start. But the first thing you really need to do is to think about the skills and attributes that are required for that role. One of the ways you can do that is really by looking at the job description. That's a good starting point. Once you've done that, you then need to assess the skills and the attributes of the person that you've recruited for the role. So it's about looking at what's required, looking at what they have, and then finding the gaps. And the gaps are really what lead you to the induction plan.
What other things should be included in your plan?
As I've already said, there are some general elements that have to go into every single plan. That might be things like organisational structure, your mission statements, your values, your philosophy. Thinking about student unions, something that had an introduction to the movement and something that really encompasses your values would be fantastic.
How should your organisation's goals or mission statement influence the induction plan?
At Ensley, we have a set of strategic aims that really influence and underpin every single thing that we do. A set of values that are included in our training and in our day-to-day activities. So it's really about thinking, how can you get your mission, your values and your ethics into everything that you do, starting with an induction plan.
Okay, so when you know what's going to be included in the induction plan, how do you deliver the training?
There are a number of different ways that you could deliver that training, and not all of them actually involve delivery. You have things like on-the-job learning, coaching, mentoring, just reading, e-learning packages, obviously your traditional talk and chalk classroom sessions, shadowing, and maybe just observing somebody else are all really, really good ways of actually learning something new.
In the guide, you cover the Kolb cycle and how people learn. What is Kolb and how do people learn?
Okay, the Kolb cycle was developed by David Kolb back in the 1970s. He started looking at the theory of learning and how people could learn most effectively. Throughout his theory, he concluded that people will learn the best through something called experiential learning, and he created a 4-stage cycle to really encompass this theory. The 4 stages of the cycle, and incidentally you can start at any stage, but generally we do start at this first stage. First stage is experience. So something concrete happens, you experience something. The second step is reflection. So we actually stop and think about what happened. So a concrete experience occurs, you then think about what actually happened. The third stage is conceptualization. That's where you start to think about why it happened, so the theory of why something happens. And then the fourth stage is experimentation. And that's really where you start to look at tweaking things so you can see if I change this, what will the outcome be? You can go through the cycle once and that's enough for you to learn effectively, or it may be that you need to go through the cycle a number of times before you perfect something.
I can imagine that some new recruits would move through the Kolb cycle naturally. How do you support people that don't?
You're absolutely right. There are some people who move through it quite nicely and other people who prefer to stick to certain stages. You can structure a training session to help somebody through the Kolb cycle and to pass through every single stage. And indeed, the questions that you ask somebody may even do that as well.
In the guide, you refer to learning styles. How do learning styles affect the way you train and develop people?
Okay. Well, the learning styles that I refer to in the guide were created by Honey and Mumford. They developed the theory of learning style preferences and came up with 4 key preferences. They were activists, reflectors, theorists, and pragmatists. Activists are the type of people that jump in at the deep end and learn by doing. They're flexible and open-minded, they enjoy new situations and really just throw themselves into it all. Each learning style has a weakness and a strength. I would say that for activists, their weaknesses involve having a tendency to take the obvious course of action without testing any others. They can also sort of seek to centre themselves around most activities as well. So they do like to be the centre of attention. They have a tendency to go into action without really thinking. So quite often they can throw themselves in at the deep end and find themselves in deep water. Reflectors are normally the quiet ones. They like to ponder and consider everything before taking a course of action. They're fantastic listeners. They don't jump to conclusions, but their careful nature sometimes means that they will hold back from involving themselves. Theorists they're logical, they're objective, they're systematic and analytical. So they may be uncomfortable with some situations in a training environment. They're very, very good at asking probing questions just to make sure that they fully understand something. But I guess those questions can sometimes be frustrating. Pragmatists are your straight-talking people. They're down to earth and they are people who are very realistic and practical. They come away from courses full of excitement and brimming with new ideas, but they have to be practical. Pragmatists will quite often say, but how can I actually apply that in the live environment? So you've got to make sure that you help them to understand theories and how they can be applied in the live environment.
And do learning styles actually affect the way you train?
They don't necessarily affect the way that you train, but they should be considered when you are designing training. As I've sort of said, a person's learning preference will quite often dictate the parts of the Kolb cycle that they prefer to be at. Your doers love the experience part, your reflectors love the reflection part. So when you structure a session, you really need to do that so that you can encourage people to go through all of the points.
And what is the cone of learning and how does this relate to learning styles?
The cone of learning is a model that was developed by Edgar Dale, and it shows how we retain information when delivered in various styles and mediums. In essence, it really looks at how important it is the way information is delivered to us and how it will impact that level of retention over time. For example, just reading information will result in an individual only retaining 10% of what was read. That's in stark contrast to the 70% that would be remembered had the information been relayed through a discussion. So essentially, an individual is likely to remember 90% of the information that was given to them if it's done in a way that it stimulates all of the senses and if it's done in an active rather than passive way. So if you want to maximise the level of information that your learners retain, you really need to consider the cone of learning when you're planning or you are delivering your training.
Okay, so now we know how people learn and what we're going to include in the induction or training plan. How do you know whether all of this effort is going to make a difference?
It's absolutely vital that you evaluate any training after it's been delivered, just to see whether or not it's achieved what you wanted it to achieve. The model that I use is the Kirkpatrick model. It is a very, very widely used model in the industry. And essentially it has 4 key stages. Stage 1 really looks at measuring how the trainee felt about the session that they've been on. So, you know, what were the objectives like? What were the handouts like? Did you like your trainer? Did you understand the objectives and so on? So it's really about how did that person feel? How did they feel when they left the training event? Stage 2 of the Kirkpatrick model is really looking at what did they actually learn. It's all very well knowing that they've enjoyed the event, but did they actually learn anything? So has their knowledge increased and have their skills increased as a result of the training? One of the quickest and easiest ways again of doing that is by asking your trainees to complete a questionnaire or a knowledge test before the training and after the training, so you have an absolute measurement of how that's increased. Level 3 is all about that transfer of learning. So we know that they've learnt something at level 2, but level 3 really focuses on whether they've taken that learning back into the live environment, which arguably is one of the most important parts. Have they been able to improve things in the live environment as a direct result of the training that you've delivered to them? Level 4 is really where you start to begin to investigate the return on investment. So for Ensley, we may start looking at our financial reports to see whether or not there has been a financial improvement. So has profit gone up? For maybe a students' union, you might be starting to look at whether or not the training that you've delivered has started to make a real difference to the lives of students.
So finally, given all of your experience in learning and development, what top tips would you give a student union?
Okay. I would probably say that preparation is absolutely vital. You've got to assess the gaps within an individual before you can create a truly effective induction plan. So it's about assessing that individual. It's also about treating people as individuals. What works for one person might not always work for another. Think about the Kolb cycle. How are you going to get people through there? And how are you going to appeal to all of those different learning styles? Remember, they are going to all prefer a certain place on the Kolb cycle, and it's your job to make sure that if they truly are to learn effectively, that they go through every single stage on that Kolb cycle. So the best piece of advice is really treat people as individuals.